Jeff, let's talk somebody who's probably on the Mount Rushmore of sports, definitely debatable among people who might not agree. David Maraniss, an award-winning New York Times bestselling author, two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, associate editor of the Washington Post, and author of the new book, Path Lit by Lightning, The Life of Jim Thorpe, joins the show. David, thank you so much for the time.
Absolutely. Glad to be with you.
This is your latest book. You've got some pretty star names on your roster. You've written biographies of Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Roberto Clemente, Vince Lombardi. Let's start there with those stories that you've already told. Why tell the story of Jim Thorpe, and why now?
Well, I sort of consider it the third book in a trilogy of biographies of sports figures who are larger than sports. The first was Lombardi, who, of course, was a fabulous football coach, winning 5 championships in 7 seasons. But what I wanted to explore in that book was the mythology of competition and success and leadership in American life and what it takes and what it costs. So I'm always looking for a great story and something larger. With Clemente, it was not just a brilliant, beautiful baseball player, but so many athletes are called heroes and almost none of them are, but Roberto really was. So a chance to write about someone who devoted his life to helping others and died trying to deliver humanitarian aid to Nicaragua. And I viewed Thorpe in a similar way, as one of the great athletes of all time, someone who did unparalleled things. You can't compare generations, really. It's foolish, but no one else had won the decathlon, been an All-American football player and a Major League Baseball player. That trifecta is unparalleled. But I also, I wouldn't have written it just for that. I saw it as an opportunity to write about the Native American experience through his life. He was from the Sac and Fox Nation. And so that was an important part of the story.
How important was it for you to tell that part of the story? We all know, I think a lot of people know that Jim Thorpe is this amazing athlete, and that's the thread that goes through his life. But how important, and what did you learn most, and what were you most concerned about when you talk about the Native American experience as told through Jim Thorpe?
It's the center of the book. I mean, the sports story sort of serves as the skeleton for a story to illuminate American history. Thorpe's life really depicts what happened to Native Americans. He was born in 1887, a year when Congress enacted the Dawes Act, which was an attempt to take away Native American land, their communal lands, and make them small property owners. That's what opened up the Oklahoma land rush land. It was Indian territory that the white people took. His key years of athleticism were at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, which was the other part of sort of the assimilation process. The motto of that school was kill the Indian, save the man, meaning take away their religion, their culture, their language, cut their hair, dress them up in cavalry uniforms and try to make them as white as possible, as the only means that certain white savior types thought they could save the Native American race. So throughout Thorpe's life, you see these various elements of the ways that white society tried to basically control and or eliminate Native Americans.
And for all the challenges with Carlisle, it also became the platform for him to be discovered along the way. You've said he was 16, he was 5'5" and 120 pounds, interested in hunting and fishing. All of a sudden, he's at Carlisle, and this electric athleticism that you talk about in the book comes out, whether it's football, track, ice skating, or ballroom dancing. Tell us more about that.
No, you're right. I mean, life is full of contradictions. And so the Carlisle Indian School, yes, it was a dehumanizing experience in many ways, but it also provided the platform to Jim Thorpe to show his incredible athletic skills. I was shocked when I saw how small he was when he got there. He filled out pretty quickly. And by 1907, he was discovered first in track and field. He hadn't done any athletics yet. And he's walking across the track and saw the high jumpers with the bar at 6 feet, and he jumped over it in his overalls. And quickly, Pop Warner, the coach at Carlisle, dragged him onto the track team, and soon he was playing football and became the star of that team for the next many years. He had this all around. If you look at the cover of the book, it's a picture of Thorpe at the Stockholm Olympics, and he just radiates this incredible electricity of an athletic, amazing figure. He could do everything. Just in football, for instance, not only was he playing 60 minutes as a great left halfback and a defensive back / linebacker, he was also a terrific punter. He could punt it 70, 80 yards routinely, and a place kicker, and even a drop kicker. So anything on a football field, Jim Thorpe could do.
You mentioned Pop Warner. Most people know Pop Warner as Pop Warner Youth Football, but Pop Warner is an integral figure in the life of Jim Thorpe, and in this book in particular. Can you tell us a little bit what you learned about Pop Warner?
Pop Warner was a brilliant, inventive, innovative football coach. He really helped develop the forward pass in early football, the single wing formation, the double wing. He had all kinds of inventions of even how to wear cleats and all of that. So he was instrumental in the greatness of those Carlisle Indian Industrial School teams, which could defeat all of the great schools on the East Coast, which were then the powerhouses. It's hard to think of today, but Yale and Harvard and Penn and Army and Syracuse, Princeton were the football powerhouses, and little Carlisle could beat them all. So that was Pop Warner as a coach. But he was also a less than noble human being. And at the point of Jim Thorpe's major crisis, when his medals were taken away from him, Pop Warner, who knew precisely what Thorpe was doing playing minor league baseball, lied about it to save his own reputation. And not long after that, the entire football team turned against him, saying that he was mentally and physically abusive to the Native American players during a congressional investigation. So he slipped out of town, went to Pitt, where he again was an incredibly successful coach, and then Stanford. And as you said, now youth football is Pop Warner football. But his days at Carlisle were great as a coach and far less than great as a human being.
That was educating to me. I did not know about the dichotomy of Pop Warner. And I said to Jeff while we were prepping, I didn't realize he bet on games that Thorpe played in and said that he was seeing his stockbroker.
Yeah, it's incredible. He bet on games. He would sell tickets to the Carlisle tickets in the hotel lobbies. He paid his players, which is another thing about, when he feigned ignorance of what Jim Thorpe playing minor league baseball. All of the players at Carlisle the best players were getting paid for years before that. Small amounts of money, but about as much as Jim was getting playing baseball. So, he was a disreputable figure in many ways and a brilliant coach.
So let's take a step back before his medals are stripped. The Olympics are sort of like a means to an end for him. He wanted to be a coach. How did the Olympics come about? And then the success of what you call the greatest single year any athlete ever had in 1912.
Well, he came back. He was recruited back to Carlisle after playing minor league baseball, and became, in 1911 and 1912, the greatest athlete in America. He was a dominant track and field star in 1911 and 1912, and he really came back in part to train for those Olympics. Pop Warner told him that if you become an Olympic star, you have a chance to make more money, and become a coach. So he went to Stockholm with Warner and with another Carlisle, a great athlete, a long distance runner named Louis Tuanama, who, by the way, won a silver medal in Stockholm. And during those Olympics, think about it. Thorpe competed in 15 events, in 2 weeks. The pentathlon is 5 events. The decathlon is 10 events. At one point during the decathlon, his shoes were misplaced, and he competed in a couple of events with shoes that he found, basically in the trash. They were different sizes. He had to wear 2 pairs of socks on one of his shoes. he still won that event. So it was extraordinary. You know, decathlons are hard to rate by different generations, not just because of the differences, as I said, in training and equipment and diet and all of that, but also because the scoring systems are different. So one thing you can say about Jim Thorpe in the 1912 Olympics is that he dominated the field in a way that no one else has before or since, in terms of points. Then he came back home to Carlisle and had this spectacular senior season as a football player. When the highlight of that year was what I call the greatest act of athletic retribution in American history, when the Carlisle Indians thumped the Army 27-6. You know, on a level playing field at last. The Indians
with Dwight Eisenhower on that field for Army, correct?
Eisenhower was a linebacker for Army. Omar Bradley was a freshman on the bench.
Thorpe comes across so many people in his life. I mean, he was on a team with Patton. He played against Eisenhower. It's just amazing all the different people that he comes across along his
He
trail.
was on the team with Avery Brundage too. It was another decathlete. You know, the villain of so many of my books, the horrible future president of the International Olympic Committee, was a decathlete. I always thought of him as this sort of fat cat potentate, but it turns out he was at least a mediocre decathlete who, by the way, quit after 8 events in those Olympics. But yes, Thorpe's life runs through, you know, not just Patton and Bradley, Omar Bradley, and Dwight Eisenhower, but also, you know, in baseball, he played for John McGraw. He played with Christy Mathewson. He traveled the world on a world tour with Charles Comiskey and several Hall of Famers, Tris Speaker and Wahoo Sam Crawford. He went out to Hollywood as a bit actor for many years and acted in 70 movies with just about every famous actor from John Wayne to Bob Hope. And then he was the movie about his life was directed by Michael Curtiz, who had directed Casablanca. He was played by Burt Lancaster. It's just incredible to see all the people that went through his life. Sat in the dugout with Babe Ruth. Played baseball at age 45 with a traveling team that played against the Negro League stars, the Pittsburgh Crawfords of Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige. I mean, it's just everybody's there.
Yeah, and yet that minor league career is kind of the sad beginnings of the end as far as taking away his medals. And you talk a lot about in the book about that minor league time where he was making $30 a month. What happened during that time, and what was the motivation for taking away the medals simply because he was playing minor league baseball, which everybody already knew about?
You know, it's true. I mean, the minor league baseball in that era, hundreds of college athletes were going to play summer baseball. Many of them were playing under aliases. Eisenhower himself played under the name Wilson, the Kansas State League. There were so many aliases in the Eastern Carolina League, where Thorpe played for the Rocky Mount Railroaders and Fayetteville Highlanders, that it was called the Pocahontas League because everyone was named John Smith. But Jim Thorpe played under the name Jim Thorpe. He never tried to hide it. His name was in the papers every day for 2 summers, you know, in Raleigh and all the other places of that league. So it wasn't a secret. And not only did Pop Warner know what Jim Thorpe was doing, but Thorpe and many other Carlisle Indian athletes were recruited by one of Pop Warner's best buddies up in Pennsylvania to play in that league. And also James E. Sullivan, who was the head of the Amateur Athletic Union and the American Olympic Committee, was also on the Carlisle Athletic Advisory Board. He too knew what Thorpe was doing, and yet he and Warner both feigned innocence after the story, quote unquote, broke in the Worcester Telegram shortly after the Olympics in January of 1913. And they're the ones who decided that he would have to return his medals and that the records would be stricken, even though technically, even you know, morally, I think it was horrible what happened to Jim, but technically it was wrong. There was a rule in the Olympic records that said that any challenge of amateurism had to be made within 30 days of the end of the Olympics. This broke 6 months later. So you can make all the arguments about how stupid the amateur rules were and how misapplied they were unfairly to various people. But even technically, Jim Thorpe shouldn't have lost his medals or records.
He goes from ticker tape parades on his way home to 6 months later being stripped of his medals. Talk about how that impacted him losing his medals, and how long did it take him to actually accept that it happened?
You know, in many ways, Jim Thorpe's life was sort of defined by loss. He was a twin. He was born a twin, and his twin brother Charlie died when they were 9 years old. He was orphaned at age 16. And then came later, his first son, Jim Thorpe Jr., died during the 1918 flu pandemic. But losing those medals would haunt him for the rest of his life. At first he was able to get over it for two reasons. One is that the sporting press, for all of its flaws, basically defended Thorpe. Almost every major sports writer was on Thorpe's side. I mean, secondly, he went off to play Major League Baseball right away. But as his athletic talents diminished, I would say, he started to ruminate more and more about the unfairness of what happened to him, and started to campaign pretty hard with so many supporters to try to get those medals back. It never happened during his lifetime. The first half-hearted effort to restore him came in 1983, before the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, when Juan Antonio Samaranch, the IOC president, presented replicas of his medals to his children, but he was not declared the winner of those medals. He was the co-winner with the second place finishers. And it wasn't really until last month, July of 2022, 110 years too late, that all of Thorpe's records were finally and fully restored.
And now you have the fact that, we talk about Bill Russell and his impact on society.
Yes.
Jim Thorpe didn't shy away from his being a Native American, and even became a leader within the Native American Actors Association. Can you tell us a little bit about his activism and his import to Native Americans and Native American culture, and how the rest of us see Native Americans?
Yeah, I mean, Thorpe is a symbol to the entire Native American population. And I view sort of his perseverance, despite all the obstacles he faced or put in his own way, including a struggle with alcohol, as sort of symbolic of the struggle of his people. There was a point in 1915 when the most popular statue in America was called The End of the Trail. And it showed a Indian on horseback stooped and defeated. It was supposed to be the end of the race, that manifest destiny had prevailed, and the Native American race was gone. It didn't happen. Native Americans went from 250,000 at the low point to millions today. They survived and prevailed. And in a sense, they see Jim Thorpe as a symbol of that survivalism notion. And you're right, his most active period identifying as a Native American leader came in Hollywood, where he got there in 1929 and was there through much of the rest of his life. And for most of the 1930s into the 1940s, he was on the edges of the studio system and became the leader of the 200 or 300 Native Americans who were trying to get acting parts or bit parts, extras in movies. And he was really pushing for two things. One is that the studios hire real Native Americans as opposed to white people dressed in grease paint to play Indians. And secondly, that they stop portraying them so negatively in the movies. And that was really the key to Jim Thorpe's activism was in Hollywood. It was something that he passed down to many of his children. His daughter, Grace Thorpe, was the spokesperson for the Native Americans who took over Alcatraz later. And many of his grandchildren and great-grandchildren are Indian activists in one way or another.
Even the movie about himself was played by a white man.
Yes, Burt Lancaster. Lancaster was a good athlete. He was an acrobat, among other things. he was 37 when he played Jim Thorpe, you know, including playing Thorpe at age 16, going to Carlisle Indian School. And they, you know, he had to use makeup as well. He didn't look or try to pretend that he looked like Jim Thorpe. I consider that movie sympathetic and completely wrong.
It was Pop Warner's version of Jim Thorpe's story, correct?
Yeah, Warner is the narrator of the movie.
Yeah.
And at the key points in the movie, you get the impression through Warner that if only Jim Thorpe had followed Warner's instructions and assimilated more easily into white society, he wouldn't have had the troubles he had. Pop Warner, the guy who turned against him at his key point, the crisis of his life.
As you were researching this book, how surprised were you about the role of Pop Warner within Jim Thorpe's life and how he did turn on him?
I knew nothing about it. So, you know, I try to approach every book, even if I know a lot about something. Like I knew a lot about Bill Clinton before I wrote about him, but nonetheless, I try to say I know nothing. I'll start from scratch to get rid of my presuppositions. But in this case with Pop Warner, all I knew was what, you know, a lot of people know, that youth football is named after the guy, you know, and that he was a successful football coach. But you know, the first revelation to me was when I got a hold of the transcripts of the congressional hearings held in 1914, investigating the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And Pop Warner is a central figure in those investigations. And that's where it was revealed all of the many things that he did wrong, you know, from betting on games to selling tickets to abusing his players physically and mentally. And then I started to put together how he handled Thorpe at the time of the medals being taken away. And that picture added up to something that was less than flattering.
I definitely learned a bunch about Pop Warner following this book. Last one for me. In his passing, there was struggle there too.
Boy, wasn't there? Yeah.
Jim Thorpe wanted to be buried in Oklahoma near his birthplace. He's not buried there. Can you explain to our listeners how Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania came about?
It's a bizarre story. He was with his third wife at that point, Patsy Thorpe, who was his business manager, his promoter, part, you know, well-motivated, trying to help him get his due, and also part grifter. And so after he died, he was taken back to Oklahoma, where he was going to be buried. And as a matter of fact, they were in the middle of a Sack and Fox important spiritual ceremony with his body when Patsy Thorpe entered the picture and took his coffin away. She was upset with how Oklahoma was treating him and what they would build, well, how they would build a mausoleum, how much money they would pay for it. And so she started sort of looking for the highest bidder. Tulsa, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. Finally, she's in Philadelphia. And this is just so weird. She sees on television a story about these two struggling towns, twin towns, in the Pocono Mountains, Mauch Chunk and East Mauch Chunk, Pennsylvania. And she came up with this plan. She was kind of like, I compare her to Harold Hill in The Music Man. She goes up there and persuades them that if they change their name to Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, she can bring not only his body, but have a college named after Jim Thorpe, a hospital, perhaps the Pro Football Hall of Fame. All of these benefits would come to this place. They changed their name. Jim Thorpe is there. You know, his bones are in a place named for him, but where he had never set foot in his entire life. And his sons, there was somewhat of a disagreement among the family. He had 7 children, 3 daughters and 4 sons. The daughters came to accept the fact that he was there and did some of their own ceremonies in Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, and just accepted it. The sons fought hard against it and filed suit, and they won in the first court, federal court. Then it was overturned on appeal, and the Supreme Court upheld the appeal. So he's not going anywhere. I have nothing against the people of Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, but I think he belongs in Oklahoma, where he was from.
Jeff knew that. I was fascinated to learn that. I had no idea about that tale as well. The book is Path Lit by Lightning, The Life of Jim Thorpe. David Maraniss, let our listeners know where they can get the book to read for themselves. It's worth their time.
Well, thank you. I hope it's available everywhere at your local independent bookstore, at Barnes and Noble, on Amazon. It's out there, believe me.
We wish you best of luck with the latest biography. Thank you so much for giving us the time and for telling the story.
Okay, thank you guys, and I love talking with you.